Hello. I am going to go over with you Chapter 2 of the Henretta book entitled American Experiments, 1521 to 1700. Keep in mind that Chapter 2 straddles periods 1 and periods 2. Period 1 goes to 1607. Period 2 starts in 1607. So keep that in mind as you're looking at your assignments for both periods 1 and 2. Okay. Be familiar with chattel slavery. This is something that developed in the colonies over the course of colonial expansion. Largely, it was in response to needing a reliable labor force. So, what makes chattel slavery different from other forms of slavery is that the children of slave mothers were considered to be slaves. So, you have a disproportionate number of slaves that are from African women, even though most slaves that were brought over were African men. It's through the slave women that the population started to grow and to expand. So it was an unfortunate development with the Americas. So be familiar with chattel slavery. It's not something that happened to start with. It developed over the course of the 17th century. Be familiar with the encomienda system, which is a form of labor organization, very feudal, and how it divided land and Native Americans between European settlers. It was eventually abandoned because it was just so harsh on Native Americans, but unfortunately, things like it stuck around. Also, the Spanish developed as the colonies became more racially diverse, something called the casta system, which divided people up but according to their proportion of European blood. So the more European you were, the higher status you were. The more mixed you were, you're further down. The more pure non-European, you were even lower. So having European blood gave you status, and the more you had it, the higher status you had. There also was a lot of forced conversion of Native Americans to Catholicism in the Spanish colonies. Be familiar with the Columbian Exchange. You're probably familiar with that from last year, but this flow of goods and services, people, animals, plants, diseases, all these things are going back and forth. So it had a very negative impact on Native Americans. You do have an activity that deals specifically with the Columbian Exchange. There's a lot of religious controversy going on in Europe in this time period. You have the Crusades in the Middle Ages that gave conflict between Europeans and people in the Muslim world. But as there was a division within the church between Roman Catholics and Protestants, that also began to fuel a lot of this competition, the development of an economic system called mercantilism. So you have an activity that also focuses on what mercantilism was. A lot of colonies are being established around plantation agriculture. In the Caribbean, it's largely sugar, and the Chesapeake region is largely tobacco, although you had other crops that were grown too. But because this was such a harsh way of producing products, they tended to bring in slaves. So, be familiar with the different areas of British settlement. This is largely a period 2 topic, but be familiar with Virginia, the establishment of Jamestown, Maryland, and the establishment of Baltimore. Both of them were established to make money. They eventually were centered on tobacco production. This is where some of the largest numbers of African slaves were first brought in. So be familiar with those two. You're going to need to know basically the 3 major regions of the British colonies in North America. These are these are some of the earliest ones that were established. In the Caribbean, as well as in the Chesapeake colonies, plantation agriculture. The goal is to bring workers over. So one of the initial things they would do is try to bring over white Europeans through something called the headright system. Farmers in the colonies would entice workers to come over from Europe. They would pay their way over, and in return, they were indentured or contracted to work so many years. For every person that could be brought over, the one that paid for their passage got 50 acres of land. And then after the end of a term of service, which was anywhere from 5 to 7 years, the indentured servant ended that and they were now a free person. This is different from chattel slavery, because while servants were treated pretty harshly back then, indentured servants were eventually allowed to be free. Once they served their term of service, it was up. Chattel slaves were slaves for life. Their children were slaves for life. So that's an important difference. Colonies were established by France, the Netherlands, as well as Britain and Spain. These colonies were very, very different with how they interacted with Native Americans. And so one of the things that I want you to do with an activity for period 2 is to look at these different neo-Europes, France in the New World, the Netherlands in the New World, and look at how they were set up and how they dealt with Native Americans. With New England, there's a lot of religious connection there. These colonies were largely established to provide a refuge for people that were in opposition to the Church of England. The Plymouth colony was established by separatists, people who had actually broken with the Church of England. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was established by Puritans, people who were trying to reform the church but still had a beef with it. Both very, very religious areas, but there were people that dissented. 2 people in particular you need to know something about are Roger Williams and then Anne Hutchinson. Both started out in the Bay Colony. They both criticized what the Bay Colony was doing religiously. Both of them were banished. And these are 2 examples of early American freedom of speech, freedom of religion. So these people were very bold, very brave. And Hutchinson and her family ultimately were pretty much massacred, wiped out because of where they settled. But they are colonial examples of people who stood up for freedom of religion and freedom of speech. Be familiar with the Salem witch trials. There's a lot of controversy about that, but this is one of these iconic moments in our history that we look back and say, yeah, we wish we hadn't done that. Arthur Miller's play The Crucible is set in Salem, but they use this event to talk about another similar event, the communist witch hunts that took place in the 1950s. So, there's a repetition of things in our history. So the Salem witchcraft trials are one of these. Lots of conflicts with Native Americans. One of your activities I'm having you do in lesson 2 or topic 2 is period 2 rather, is look at these conflicts and what the end result was. With the Pequot War, you pretty much have a wiping out of an entire group of people. With Metacom's War or King Philip's War, it stops Native American opposition to colonial presence, European presence forever. You also had the Anglo-Powhatan War that took place in Virginia, which pretty much stopped Virginia Native Americans from being in opposition to Europeans. You have Bacon's Rebellion, which was a poor person's revolt against colonial power that was starting to develop with the wealthy elites. You have people in the western part of Virginia that felt like they weren't being treated properly. They felt like Native Americans were being treated better. So this was an uprising against that authority. So you start to see that tension between rich and poor, coastal people versus inland people, east versus west. You start to see some regional differences develop. So quick recap, know something about Columbian Exchange, know something about Maryland's Act of Toleration, one of the first places where all Christians were granted freedom of worship, know something about the headright and indentured servant systems, know what the Chesapeake was, know that it was largely a plantation area, lots of indentured servants were brought over, and then lots of chattel slavery. It's also the first place where they began to have run-ins with Native Americans because of expansion. Be familiar with the Neo-Europes like New France, New Netherlands, and how they dealt with Native Americans. Know something about Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson as examples of people who fought against authority in Massachusetts. And then know something about Bacon's Rebellion and how that showed a growing social tension within the colonies between the rich and the poor, people in the West, people in the East. Okay. As always, if you have any questions, let me know. And thank you. I will see you with chapter 3.